or she, whatever, they will be breathing in the carbon monoxide. And we're going to see in their lungs, we're going to see a noticeable amount of carboxyhemoglobin. That's the hemoglobin with the carbon monoxide stuck to it. And it does stick. It does stay there. And therefore, technically speaking, a person's lungs are a way of getting carbon monoxide out of the air. So we're going to examine their lungs and see whether and how much carboxyhemoglobin there is. Basically, how much carbon monoxide there is in their lungs. Now, this is only true, it only builds up if the person is alive and breathing during the fire. But if the person is dead before the fire, they're not going to breathe, and the lungs are simply not going to pick up the carbon monoxide. You will not have any carboxyhemoglobin in the lungs. So it's very important when we find a body that was killed or that was found in a fire, an arson or just any fire. We're going to check the lungs. We're going to see if there's a carboxyhemoglobin. If there is no carboxyhemoglobin in the lungs, then this person was dead before they got into the fire. So maybe the person killed this victim and then threw their body somewhere and burned everything. But there's no carboxyhemoglobin in the lungs. There will then we know that the person was killed elsewhere. So there's also sometimes when they breathe it in, if there's a lot of smoke, they may breathe in the smoke, and the soot can get into the lungs. Not just carboxyhemoglobin, even soot. And sometimes again, it's in the mouth. So a person swallows while their faces are full of smoke. It can even get in the stomach. These are things we can examine from dead bodies and learn a little bit more about how they died. So that's with smoke, but with smoke and fire. But besides this way of destroying the ability to breathe, death by asphyxiation comes from hanging, strangulation, and smothering. These are the more commonly recognized ways of a person dying through asphyxiation. Incidentally, it's called asphyxiation. There's no oxygen because the carbon dioxide takes the place of the oxygen. The body cannot breathe. It cannot breathe oxygen because there's carbon monoxide all over the lungs. This, by the way, is not only true for fire victims. A person could be in a car, and as the car engine keeps burning the gasoline, it can produce carbon monoxide, and the person can die if they're in an enclosed area breathing in the carbon monoxide. So again, these are other things to pay attention to. Okay, so let's look at the hanging. Now, this is not exactly caused necessarily, anyway, by an inability to breathe. Now, a lot of people don't understand hanging, and they think that, well, the person hangs, the noose around the neck prevents them from breathing. Well, there's more than one way to die by hanging. For these public executions where they wanted it quick, they didn't always want it quick, but where they did want it quick, what they would do is they would attach the noose to the neck, then remove the floor from the person they wanted to execute, and the person would fall. Now, one side of him, the head would fall on one side of the noose, and the body would fall on the other side of the noose. Effectively, if it was quick enough, it would actually snap the spine right at the noose. Like breaking a chopstick. You put a little pressure in the middle of the chopstick, pull down on both sides, it'll snap the chopstick. Same thing. When you have the rope around the neck and the head on one side and the body on the other, it falls with fast enough, with enough force, you'll snap the neck at the noose. But sometimes they didn't want the person to die that quickly. So another method of killing through hanging, and these are usually like the lynching cases. Sad though they were, but this is how they often work. Where they didn't want the person to die quickly, they would put the noose around them, and instead of, let's say, letting the person fall a distance where the neck would snap, the person did not fall that much of a distance, and the person was just left hanging by the neck. And this rope, depending on the kind of rope, would cut off the oxygen and the person couldn't breathe. That's one way. But that also killed within a few minutes, and sometimes people wanted a lot more struggle. So the way their nooses were is that it would not completely cut off the oxygen. The person could still breathe more or less, but the blood in the blood vessels were so constricted that the oxygen from the blood could not get to the brain. And this is the hanging that we're talking about, the death by lack of blood flow to the brain, where the noose, or whatever it was, whatever they used, would stop the blood flow to the brain. So this often results in purple and blue facial features because the more oxygen in the blood, the redder it is. So the person that cuts off the oxygen via the noose, they'll have more bluish or purplish facial features. So we see a death like this. If there's a knot in the noose, we have to know what kind of a knot it was. Death by hanging is actually a form of suicide. People do try to commit suicide that way. And sometimes the type of knot can tell us a little bit about it. Like it was a very complicated or complex knot, and the person really didn't know much about knots, but his next door neighbor was a sailor, or maybe a Boy Scout or something like that. They knew all about knots. This is a complicated knot. Well, maybe it wasn't a suicide. You often find what they call ligature marks. Those are like marks around the neck, bruises around the neck caused by a rope. Now, it doesn't always happen. There are ways of avoiding it during hanging. That's the hanging due to lack of blood flow, which is, again, slower death. Here, there's something called Petechiae. These are, we'll deal with this, we'll show this a little bit, we'll show this soon. This is where blood vessels burst. Often it can happen because the heart, the brain says, hey, my head's not getting oxygen, you got to pump that heart harder. So, but again, if they can't breathe, all that that forcefully pumped blood is not going to help. But it's going to be forcefully pumped enough that it'll actually burst capillaries, and it's noticed, especially in the inner eye. Those are Petechiae. Well, we can deal with them shortly. When a person is hanged, well, again, not much blood gets there, so the heart doesn't pump the blood as well to these parts, so you don't have the Petechiae. So here's what Petechiae are. Here's sorry about the picture, but hey, you got to see it. See there, that's where the blood vessels burst. That's in the inner side eye. So you examine that. The people, the people doing the autopsy, they examine that. They look for that. If that happens, okay, strangulation, asphyxiation. That's what people start thinking. Anyway, strangulation, not hanging necessarily. This is death when you actually die by oxygen lack. That's asphyxiation. But this is an inability to breathe, like the trachea, from which a person gets his intake, takes in oxygen, is closed off. So this requires, the most efficient, I can't say best, the most efficient way of doing this is with a very thin cord, like a wire. Of course, a wire can cut through the skin, but assuming it's not that thin, a wire a wire that is used and it pulls back at the throat, at the trachea. This like seals off the trachea and prevents any oxygen from getting there. The blood might get through with a short, at least the brain doesn't die because the blood doesn't get through because enough blood is in there, but the oxygen is immediately cut off, totally. And this often causes what they call hypothyroid damage because you're really forcefully yanking on this this thin wire or this thin string or rope, so that and there's a lot of pressure there, and you're going to cause a lot more damage here. And you find defensive bruises here because they jerk around to try to get this thing off their neck because it's very powerfully strangling them. So you can actually see defensive bruises. It's another kind of a sign. You'll notice that